be doing session 2 of the sort of 30,000 view of the Bible, and I was correct last week to say that we're doing Exodus through Judges today, and so I'm excited about jumping into that. There's a lot that we're going to have to get through to do that, so get some water and we'll go. All right, so after Genesis, we have a large collection of books that sort of guide us through the difference or the history between when we left Joseph and his brothers in Egypt and when the people of Israel enter into the land. Okay, so the books we're going to talk about today are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. So we have 6 books today. Okay, now when we look at these books, we have to remember that the sort of pacing of time or history is going to start and stop as we move through the books. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. The first few chapters of Exodus move very much like we see in Genesis. We have the depiction of Moses' birth and his childhood and his time in Egypt, and we have the interaction with Pharaoh that leads us to the Exodus. And so that brings us to about chapter 19 of Exodus. Now, then everything sort of pauses because chapters 20 through the end of Exodus are just the recounting of what Moses receives as the law on Sinai, right? So he receives the 10 Commandments, but the way Exodus depicts it is that he's actually receiving everything that's the end of Exodus. So that would be chapters about 20 through 40. And so in that, there's a lot of details. We have a lot of laws, we have a lot of regulations and rules, we have a description of how the tabernacle is built, and then we actually see it being built, right? We have this sort of one-to-one correspondence. God tells Moses to build the tabernacle and the curtains and the rods and the ark and the altars in a certain way, and then we see those actually happening, okay? Leviticus then fits into that as an extension or a restatement of the tabernacle rules. Okay, so most of the book of Leviticus is focused on what happens in the tabernacle. How do you do a sacrifice? When do you have to do a sacrifice? What is the sacrifice for? Who can do a sacrifice, right? And then there's very few stories in Leviticus, but there's a lot of sort of what we might call owner's manual in Leviticus, right? Then we get back to the book of Numbers, and the book of Numbers gets us sort of back into the flow, right? If you think of the end of Exodus and Leviticus as sort of like reading the owner's manual, now we're going to put the car back into drive. And so Numbers picks up very closely to where we left off in Exodus 19. As in telling us history, telling us events. We see Israel throughout the book of Numbers. We see Israel going from place to place to place, and we see more dialogue, and we see more sort of events, right? We get to the end of the book of Numbers, and the nation of Israel is at the edge of the promised land. They've come up around, wandering for 40 years, and they reach the promised land, and then we pause again. And the book of Deuteronomy is a restatement or a repetition of that owner's manual we saw at the end of Exodus and Leviticus. All right? So Deuteronomy is structured as a sort of a long sermon or a long speech by Moses in which he's going to come back and repeat the 10 Commandments and repeat the promises of God, repeat the plans and how do you do this and how do you do that? And then that book, Deuteronomy, is going to end when Moses dies. We sort of get the very last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy is entitled The Death of Moses, and we sort of see him go up Mount Nebo, and he dies, and then Joshua is now the leader of the people. Okay? So then We push play again, and in Joshua and Judges, we see history moving forward in a sort of sequential way again, right? So Joshua and the children of Israel enter into the land. They start conquering cities. They start having events that happen with them. And then at the end of Joshua, the appearance is that they have completed the conquest, right? But if you look very closely, at the end of Joshua, the series of chapters say, okay, this tribe goes to this part of the land, and this tribe gets to go to this part of the land, and this tribe, they have their house over here. But you'll see that it says, but they did not fully conquer the people there, right? That's sort of a repetition you see through Joshua, is that they get like 80% there. I'm just sort of putting a number on it, right? They conquer the land, they're in control of it, but really, there's still some pockets of the old peoples there. There's still some resistance to the conquest that's happened. And so that's where Judges is going to pick up. Judges is going to pick up with this cycle that's going to take us several generations, in which each successive generation of Israel kind of goes up to conquest, and then they get conquered themselves. And then they go and they conquer, and then they're conquered themselves. We go back and forth. And so the book of Judges you can almost think of as sort of like sometimes it's depicted as a cyclical history, that you can look at the events within these sort of plots. A judge, God picks a judge, and then the judge frees Israel from captivity or from their oppressors, and then they have these, this wonderful conquest, and then they worship God for a little bit, but then they forget God, and then God is going to punish them because they're forgetting him and not worshiping him, and then they're conquered again, and then we get to the next judge, right? So we have sort of a circle that can be formed. Or you can think of it in terms of this sort of back and forth rocking, like they conquer and then they are conquered, and then they conquer and then they're conquered, right? There's no real progress that's being made in the book of Judges, right? From Genesis, we go into Egypt, we come out of Egypt in Exodus, we go through the Sinai Peninsula in Numbers, we enter the land with Joshua, and then we get kind of stuck in a holding pattern in the book of Judges. Okay, so that's the large kind of overview we're going to enter into. Now, the other thing we need to do is come back to this idea of history versus sort of owner's manual. Okay, so when we look at Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua, we see a sort of coherent arc of coming out of Egypt, up through the land, and into the promised land with conquest. And with the book of Judges, again, like I said, we have this idea of being stuck or being paused, of making no real progress. And the issue that should be raised here is one of faithfulness, right? So in talk about where we talked about last week, Genesis is all about the origin of the covenant that God makes with Israel. And of course, God always kept his end of the bargain, right? Like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they did not keep covenant, right? God kept covenant, and they were blessed by it. And so we get that extended in Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua to their descendants, right, to the nation of Israel. And again, God is keeping covenants. Israel is not keeping the covenant. That's a particular theme within the book of Numbers, is that they rebel against God in the very beginning. They could have gone straight up and conquered the land and been there pretty quickly. But they rejected God and decided to go their own way. And so God punished that generation with being stuck in the wilderness, right? So we kind of have this idea of like wandering of the wilderness. They weren't really wandering. They knew exactly where they were going to go. They just weren't permitted to go there, right? They were being kept out of the promised land because that generation that had rebelled against God had to die in the wilderness, and their children were the ones that were going to conquer with Joshua, okay? And so the idea of how covenant plays out is a major sort of plot point that we're going to see, that we see in Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. Now, in counterpoint to that, or sort of on the other side, Leviticus, well, the end of Exodus and Leviticus, and Deuteronomy sort of form not just the owner's manual of all the rules and regulations, they also sort of re-describe or reconceptualize what the covenant with God looks like. Okay? So at this point, we can say there are three types or three versions of the covenant that we see between Genesis and, we'll say, Joshua. We don't really see much covenant in Judges. And so the first kind of covenant I'm going to call the Genesis covenant, right? That's the one that's made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that covenant is fixed mainly around the idea of land, wealth, and prosperity, or progeny, or children, right? And you can think of that as a personal covenant. So the Genesis covenant is a personal covenant, okay? When we move into Exodus and Leviticus, the covenant becomes a religious covenant, right? So the end of Exodus and Leviticus is all about the tabernacle. So you can sort of, if you think of the first covenant as being based in the patriarchs and the families, the Exodus Leviticus version of the covenant is based on the holiness or the righteousness of the people in relationship through the tabernacle. Okay, so for that version of the covenant, the relationship between God and humans is always pivoting or centered on the altar, the sacrifice, the tabernacle, the religious aspects of Israel. Okay? And then our third version of the covenant, the Deuteronomy covenant, we can call that a national covenant. Right? So just to review, because I'm probably talking faster than some of you are writing. So Genesis is a personal covenant, Exodus, Leviticus is a religious covenant, and Deuteronomy is a national covenant or a political covenant. Right? And so if you look at Deuteronomy, the way the covenant is described is Israel as a nation. Right? We're going to talk about kings. We're going to talk about judges. We're going to talk about how do you settle disputes. How do you deal with inheritance of land. It's very, civic and contractual in the way it thinks of things. Okay? Now, this is all to say and introduce a debate that we see within biblical studies. So we have these three kinds or versions of covenants, and I'm going to say it that way, because the question is, are they all the same covenant sort of seen from different vantage points, right? If I look at it in terms of what is my personal relationship with God, in terms of my religious relationship with God, in terms of my civil national relationship with God, right? So it all could be one covenant just sort of seen from different facets or vantage points. The other side of that discussion is that it's three different covenants. Right? So we don't have covenant, singular. We have covenants, plural, right? And again, we have a personal covenant, a religious covenant, and a national covenant. Now, this tension does not get resolved in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But the debate, the discussion between the three is going to carry us into the New Testament. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit to resolve the tension. I call it three versions of a singular covenant because of Jesus. Right? When we see the way that the Gospels are going to be constructed, the way the Gospels are going to approach this personal covenant, this religious covenant, this national covenant, the Gospels help to sort of square the circle. They help to bring all of these three perspectives into one and sort of harmonize it together, right? So we can talk about, the scarlet thread of redemption that goes to the Bible. I like to think of the Bible a little bit more like a tapestry. It has a lot of different threads And they all come together and weave to form a pattern that shows us that even though we have different colors and different strands at different places, they all work together to create a consistent, coherent idea, which is God's relationship with humanity. Again, that relationship with humanity is personal. It is religious, and for some people, like Israel, it is political or national. Okay? And then when Jesus comes, he sort of flips that around, turns it upside down, and portrays it to us in a different way. Right? So again, we can take that personal covenant of land, wealth, and progeny, and we can look at it from the spiritual perspective instead of the human perspective, right? So in our culture, we have this sort of fixation with prosperity, right? Like God is going to bless us if we keep all of his commandments. He's going to give us, the big McMansion and the BMW and lots of money and things like that. We get that idea from a poor reflection of what the Bible actually says is prosperity, right? So instead of God blessing us with cash money, he blesses us with the overabundant wealth of his righteousness, right? That we are called his children and we are adopted into his family is actually what that personal, relational, genetic covenant that we see with the patriarchs in Genesis, that's what it's really pointing to, right? So, and Paul picks up on this. He's going to talk about this in Romans. He's going to talk about this in Galatians, that, to Abraham, the promise was given that from his seed would come many nations, right? And that is really where the gospel becomes personal. Many different nations are brought together into this adopted family of God. And it's not just the genetic lineage of a couple of people that are doing that. I guess that's one. Two, let's talk about this Exodus Leviticus, right? If we go back to Exodus Leviticus, we look at the tabernacle, then we see that we could never do that, right? In many ways, there's an ongoing discussion within early Christianity and within the rabbinic Jews and non-rabbinic Jews at the time of the New Testament and a few centuries after that about what exactly do you have to do to keep some of these laws, particularly when there's not a tabernacle and a temple anymore. Right? Remember, after 70 CE, Jerusalem is leveled essentially, and there is no temple. So you can't bring a sacrifice if you don't have a temple and you don't have an altar. So how do you keep this, right? And the New Testament answers the question saying, Jesus is our temple, Jesus is our sacrifice, Jesus is our high priest. By the way, this is coming from the book of Hebrews. Right, the book of Hebrews basically takes all of Leviticus and Exodus and breaks it down and puts it back together and shows us that it's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus with a side of Jesus, that he fulfills everything that this Exodus Leviticus, what we might call the priestly covenant, he's going to do all of that. Okay, and again, the idea there is the priestly covenant is focusing on holiness and righteousness and salvation. And thus, the New Testament is going to point out how Jesus is the Holy One that gives us his righteousness and provides for our salvation, to kind of tie that up with a bow. All right, so then we have the third covenant, the Deuteronomy covenant, that national, civil, political covenant, right? And within that, we see that Jesus becomes the prophet that, again, if you go back to Deuteronomy, the big figure that they're going to see is you see this elevation. We talk about judges first, we talk about civil leaders, then we talk about the king in chapter 17 and 18, and then at the end of 18 in chapter 19, we start talking about the prophet who will follow Moses. And Jesus takes that role upon himself. He calls himself the prophet. In fact, in the book of John, they have a discussion about that. And they say, are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? Are you the Messiah? And he's like, yes. I'm all of it. If you're looking for it, I'm him. And so he's going to take that mantle upon himself. And this is where particularly, and again, we'll probably be able to talk about this in more detail when we do it sort of on a slower pace. There's sort of what's called the threefold office right? That Jesus is a prophet, he is a priest, and he is a king, right? This discussion occurs, again, at many different places in the New Testament. The book of Hebrews has a discussion about it. How can he be a priest if he's not from the tribe of Levi? The book of Revelation talks about it in terms of him being both a sacrifice and a king. Romans is going to deal with it a little bit from the national perspective. How can he be the Messiah if he's also bringing Gentiles, and what does this mean? And again, I'm having to just brush over a lot, I know, because we're trying to keep it short and just an appetizer right now. All right, so those three covenants are not really three covenants. They're three versions of the same covenant that God is making with his people in Egypt, sustaining with them through the promised land, culminating in the Messiah Jesus. Okay, so I have a little bit left to do in my time. All right, so I have to come back to this idea of the judges, right? So another element we're kind of seeing in here is what I want to call the tension of Scripture. We get different versions of similar ideas, similar events that occur in these books. And we're going to see that, by the way, as we move on in the rest of the Old Testament. And we can even say that's true of the New Testament. Right? So let me explain it this way, right? So we have that Leviticus Exodus covenant and that Deuteronomy covenant. And if you look closer at the details of those two, they're talking to each other, right? Leviticus says you have to sacrifice animals this way. And Deuteronomy says, no, you can sacrifice them this way. And Deuteronomy says, well, you have to go to the temple and go to the tabernacle or to the temple on these days and this way. And Leviticus says, no, you're going to do it this way, right? So there's a tension. There's what some people might call a contradiction between them. Okay, I'm going to let that hang for a second. Let me get to the other tension or contradiction, right? We'll talk about Joshua Judges here. So in Joshua leads the people up. They're conquering the land. They're taking it all. They're very successful. God is always blessing them. There is no problems. Book of Judges. They are pathetic. They can't get anything done. They never get to own their own land. There's all the Ammonites, and the Moabites, and the Gilgashites, and the Philistines are always invading them. They never have a moment's peace. Different versions of the history of Israel in the Promised Land. Okay, so we have this historical contradiction or tension. We have a ideological, between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, contradiction or tension. And again, the way I want to say this is, life is not clean cut. And the Bible pays homage to that by giving us a different perspectives on the same events. So I'm a student of history. That's what I'm working on my dissertation with. And one of the things I'm looking at is how different historians think about and write history in different ways, right? And so I'm not going to bore you with my dissertation ideas right now because we don't have enough time for that. But history is not a singular narrative. There is not one version of history, right? I'll write my history of what we're going through in the quarantine and what coronavirus is like for me, from my perspective. You are probably going to write a different history, right? You have a different experience. It may be worse than mine. It may be better than mine. You may be dealing with different things that I do. You may think that the future generations need to know something different about the history, right? So you're going to emphasize different things about the same events. We can think about this like a car accident, right? One car hits another car at the stoplight, right? And you ask all the witnesses what happened, and the versions will be similar, but different. And if we only had one version of the history, then that would open up the Bible to the idea that we had sort of whitewashed everything over, right? We had sanitized all of the naughty bits away. We had only gotten the version that made us look the best. Instead, what we get is this ongoing sort of tension between different voices, different perspectives, right? We have the perspective of the priests who are at the tabernacle and the temple, and they have their perspective of what's important. We have the perspective of the prophets who are talking to the kings and sort of guiding the nation politically. We have a different perspective, the people who are writing for the personal expression, right? We're getting different versions of the history put together, and that tension never really gets resolved in the sense of we only are going to follow this one, we're not going to follow this one. And that sometimes makes us uneasy about the Bible, right? We can talk about it, right, also with the Gospels. Why do we have 4 Gospels? Why are 3 of them very similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And one of them is very, very different, John. And people go back and forth, well, they're not that different, they're the same, but then there's also these differences. And I mean, you can get on Google, put in Bible inconsistencies, and you're going to find 500 things about the Old Testament and 500 things about the Gospels and 450 things about Paul that people are going to nitpick apart. And then you go to the next link and you find all the solutions for all of those controversies, right? The idea is that humans and history have to pay credit to what happens. And when we write down history, which is what the Bible is, it's a history of God's interactions with the people. It has to bring in all these voices, right? We're not all going to be completely obsessed with the Leviticus way of doing things, right? There are some people who love Leviticus, and there are some people who hate Leviticus. If you've ever tried to read through your Bible from Genesis to Revelation, there is always somewhere, usually it's Leviticus or Chronicles, that your brain just sort of seizes up and you can't keep going because you're just so bored with what's going on, right? It makes no sense, right? That's why I like to think of Leviticus like the owner's manual. It's like reading the book about how to do things, and you're like, I don't care how many goats it is. I don't care about goats right now. But the Bible thought that that was important for us to have. We may not like it, but it was a perspective we needed to know about. And so as we move forward and we talk about sort of differences between the versions or the stories or the rules, or the covenants, or whatever it is, just keep that in mind that we are paying attention to all the different details. We're not just getting one perspective. But all of those perspectives focus together on a singular message, which is what we would call the gospel or the covenant that God has with us, right? How God is relating to us in history. This is why I think the Bible still speaks to us in the modern day, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I'm not plowing a field with my oxen and trying to figure out whether I'm supposed to mix the 2 seeds together or not. That is not a concern that I have in the year 2020. But I do see myself in the stories that I have throughout it, right? There are times when I am with David in exile, running from Saul, feeling like I'm alone. There are times that I am with Solomon, praying for wisdom, seeking God's face. There are times when I'm happy. There are times when I'm angry. There are times when I'm confused. And the Bible gives us history, gives us narratives of people's lives that we can relate to. And not everyone's life is going to be the same. And thus we have to have this we have to tolerate the tension within Scripture because our own lives will change from day to day. But also we live in a world where people live different lives than we do. That's sort of my explanation for why there are contradictions in the Bible. Okay.